Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see so many of you up and about. And how are your sea legs doing? Well, you always need one more. That's what I found out. And it's that old saying, it's an old Norse saying, I stagger on land because I had to stagger at sea. Then, of course, we have that saying rock and roll. Now you know where it came from out here. But I'm glad to see so many of you up. I'm going to talk today about the ocean itself, now that we've been out and we're getting into the real Caribbean and the real humid air and the various beauties of the Caribbean. Oh, by the way, I've gotten rid of my Quaker business suit outfit, and hereby we are all casual. We're having a contest who can have the loudest, gaudiest, and silliest shirt or sarong or beach wear, the winner of which will win a limited edition Silver Sea coconut to take home as a true trophy of the Caribbean. But today I'm going to talk about the ocean again as we are on it. And of course, this is a very unusual part of the world in that it's been called the Mediterranean of the Americas, because you have this string of islands to the east and then very large islands, the biggest being Cuba, Dominican Republic, Hispaniola. Then you have these specific basins. The Caribbean Sea is actually the south of the Antilles Islands. We are currently in the old Bahamian Channel, coming off of the Straits of Florida down north of Puerto Rico now. We went out actually Exuma and came down now due south to Puerto Rico, and then we'll continue on our way. Then there's the Yucatan basin, and then the Gulf of Mexico. And so this creates certain hydrological effects that give it an unusual quality as a sea. First of all, there's very little tide, like the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean is more of a lake by contrast, completely surrounded by land almost. The Caribbean is sort of open ocean dotted with pieces of land that then create high currents and winds, primarily driven by the trade winds coming from the African coast, and then up the currents flow up into the Gulf of Mexico and then begin the turning around the Straits of Florida and make the Gulf Stream. And that is, of course, a major effect on the climate of the North Atlantic and all the way to Europe. This basin was made by, again, the tectonic plate movement of the Earth. The Caribbean plate, the North America, South American, have met in the Caribbean and are still grinding along and moving somewhat, and that's why there are terrible earthquakes, active volcanoes, among all the other attractions of the area. But back in prehistory, about 60 million years ago, the Atlantic and the Pacific were actually connected, and you can see where Africa, Ghana, separated going to the east, and South America went south, and then rose up in Central America a number of volcanoes that are still active there today that then cut off the Atlantic and the Pacific. That changed the world's climate dramatically at the time, including causing the desertification of North Africa to the Sahara, which had been a tropical jungle in millions of years before. And so this made the Caribbean a basin that was somewhat isolated, well, completely cut off until the Panama Canal opened up a transit in Panama. But the tectonic plates have these rings of fire, literally, with volcanic activity all the way from Central America around to the islands where we're going, and then down on the South American coast. It also made for very shallow basins, continental shelves, and also some of the deepest trenches, the deepest being off of Puerto Rico at about 25,000 feet deep, 7,535 meters deep. The other one under the Cayman Islands is the other great deep, and this is a subduction area that again is caused by the plates moving and uplifting the islands. There are about 7,000 islands, not of any size, not just spits, let's say, but only about 200 of them are populated because They're either sandy spits in the Bahamas or little bits of rocks all over the place. The major ones, of course, being the settled islands of where we're going. This is a curious graphic of gravity pressure on the Earth, which is an indicator of how deep the crust is, what kind of rocks there are, and so that there's images that you can see where the pressure is on the plate that are helping to predict when there'll be an earthquake or volcano. The Gulf of Mexico is its own sea, say, because it again is almost completely contained, other than the passage by Yucatan, Cancun, and then out to Florida Straits. And this is the warmest sea, other than the Red Sea, in the world. And it's mainly because it's getting warm tropical waters that are flowing from the east to the west, up through the channel, and then circulating around the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, that has a real problem because when hurricanes come through, that amplifies the storm. Now, where we are coming due south to San Juan, and then we'll be threading our way through the various islands. And you can see there are all these passages, the Mona Passage, the Negada Passage, the Guadalupe Passage, and so these are very important in the early exploration and settlement on all of these islands, because some of these passages would be guarded by navies, or else they would have either ready access when the weather was calm, but then they often were terribly stormy, so that islands would be cut off from each other variously. And of course, I mentioned how all these different islands there's 16 different nations. There are 2 U.S. territories, 4 French, 4 Dutch, and 2 British. And so this is where this group of islands have, let's say, cultural differences and variety. Come on down to the South American coast, you have Trinidad, Tobago, the different Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, those are the Dutch islands. And then off to the west, you get the Great Gulf of Maracaibo, and then the Great Lake of Maracaibo, which I'll show a bit later more of. Then you have mountains on the Colombian coast, particularly around Santa Marta, where you have the unusual quality, if you've ever been there, of having snow-capped peaks looking out over the Caribbean Sea. And these are a separate mountain group from the Andes. It's its own Sierra de Santa Marta, it's called. And it is over 15,000 feet high, over 5,395 meters high, so that it has one of the greatest biodiversity of any part of the Caribbean area, just because it has high alpine and then snow-capped peaks, and then goes right down to the jungle, then you go to the beach. So you can actually have all vacations in once in this particular area. Go skiing and then go warm yourself up in the tropical waters. It was a closed area through the Colombian Civil War, particularly because it has some of the oldest intact and unassimilated native people that live up there, Kuna people they're called, up in those high mountains where they have rope bridges that do not allow anybody to pass. But I'll talk about that another day. This is more about just the land and water itself. So then you can come up from Panama or Costa Rica. The coast of Nicaragua is called the Mosquito Coast because that's a vast mangrove jungle that is almost impenetrable and swampy. It's been the subject of some thriller movies and things like that. But Hurricane Mitch in 2005, I think it was, just completely wasted that coast. So now it is much of the forest has been destroyed, and is one of these cases where in the Caribbean, about every 20 years, wherever you are, will get smashed by a hurricane, or what I call Caribbean roulette. And one island after the other gets destroyed, and then it reblooms. Of course, some of the humans don't, but that's pretty unpopulated coast. There are the mosquito natives that live in the forest there. Then you go around to Belize, the Roatan Islands, up to the Yucatan. You've probably been to Cozumel, Cancun, and all that area. And the Yucatan is its own ecosystem of limestone and underwater caves and things. The south coast of Cuba is particularly beautiful. It doesn't get storm damage very much usually in what they call the Bahia Garden de Reina, the Garden of the Queen, named by the Spanish because it has such exquisite coral calm waters in this bay off the Isla de Juventud. And curiously, the Castro government made it a biosphere preserve back when they founded the current government of Cuba, so that it was never developed even for the Cubans. You had to be a government official to go in. Now they allow divers and sailors and tourists in, but still no Cubans are allowed to go there except to service the high-end tourist activity in that bay, because it is one of the great intact coral areas of all of the Caribbean. But you've seen these islands. They're often just a flat spit, coral buildup, few palm trees, and then endless beaches. This is actually the coast of Texas. And so you have either the flat, or else you have what we're going to, or the volcanic mountainous peaks, which have been formed by this series of, these are all the active earthquakes in recent times and active volcanoes. So we're going down into one of the hotbeds of it all down there in the Leeward Islands. But it's even more active in, of course, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, places like that where the land is still rising. This is the island of Montserrat, which is a British overseas territory, but it had its volcanic eruption that meant they had actually evacuated the whole island. The town of Plymouth was evacuated, and it's still smoking. We go by it and can see that it's still making a little noise over there. We don't get close enough to it. I was on the Silver Shadow last month, and we went to the Canary Islands and saw the La Palma eruption. That was the biggest one I've ever seen, 10,000 meters of plume and steam. And of course, someone asked, could we take the ship by and get a closer look? And Captain Palmieri said, oh, of course, but you'll have to help us clean the ship after we get near it. Well, these are navigational hazards, and there's one where we are going, just north of Grenada, called Kikum-Jenny, which is a volcano undersea that occasionally gets up and starts spitting, particularly at a nice cruise ship that's going by. It throws rocks at the ships that go by. So on the nautical chart, there's a big circle around it. Don't wake up Jenny, because she'll kick you. Well, we're going to this island, Antigua, which is a beautiful scallop bay, hilly, some forests, and this is the prototypical volcanic island that rose and has been descending. The volcano is extinct here. The hot spot moved elsewhere. And so it makes for very dramatic shores with beaches and rocks and cliffs and things like this. And we'll see this, what I call the Gibraltar of Barbados on the west coast of Barbados. This is an example of called an ejecta, which is a volcano that throws big boulders like this, and you see them in different places. These are also the Piton. I showed this the other day. We'll go and see it in Dominica, and then also in St. Lucia, these volcanic spikes that are the remnant, again, of the rise of the island and the erosion. All of them have, as I mentioned, also the steamy soufriere, they're called. The vents from the volcano can be found in the countryside, and of course they're a source of hot water, such as the boiling lake in Dominica. But you can also see them on other shores. This is in BBI, and with the boulders at the baths, it's called. I don't know if any of you have been there, but that's a particularly lovely spot, particularly if you go in your own private charter boat, or you go there and spend a while and get lost in the caverns of these particular gigantic boulders that were blown over here millions of years ago. There's no current activity on that particular island, but sometimes you have to make your way through with the proper guide who can make a passage for you to get back to your hotel. But it's a beautiful thing, because in the midday sun you can go in and find a nice pool like this to go swimming in. And it's quite lovely. And here's a former coral that decided to come up for a view. I'm not sure why. Here's another curious place in the Bahamas. That's Andros Island, if you've ever been there. And that's called, and this bit of deep water amidst the very shallow sea is called the hole in the sea, which I was once in my kayak going island hopping through there, and I was stopped by a Navy patrol boat saying, you can't come into this because this is where they train submarines in this enclosed water. So it's now used for certain purposes, not vacationing. Here's the more famous blue hole of Belize. Maybe you've been there also, with the limestone walls that go down a few dozens of meters into the sea, and it's a sort of an enclosed little piece of water that then is open at the bottom. But it's a diver's dream trip to go down into that very clear water. I mentioned the currents. They come through up past Cuba into the Gulf of Mexico, and they start looping around because they have no place really to go until they finally get picked up, and like a slingshot, the water then rushes out past the Strait of Florida. Now, this has been called the greatest river in the world because it has something like 9,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools passing every second past Miami. And this water pressure then accelerates all the way out, and it meets the North Atlantic, cooler waters coming down from the Arctic, and it can create that kind of fog and bad weather in the north. But meanwhile, it creates warmth that can be felt all the way to, famously, Scotland and the coast of Norway. And one of the great questions in climatology now is, if it slows down because of changes in oceanographic currents, will Europe start to be back to its normal temperatures at that latitude? Well, we hope not. But this is the tremendous Gulf Stream that then creates eddies that have pockets of warm water that extend into the cold water and even carry turtles and tropical fish all the way to Europe. Another phenomena around here is the infamous Bermuda Triangle, which is, we are in it right now. Can't you tell? The ship is sort of floating somewhere, I don't know. But anyway, between Bermuda, Puerto Rico, and Miami, the real problem is that ships would go in there and they would disappear. And there are many reasons for it, but particularly in modern times, airplane squadrons in training would go out, and then they also would disappear. And so this is always a question: what is it about this stretch of the ocean? This is not actually in the Caribbean side. This is just nearby where we are right now. And there are other anomalies. For instance, this is a compass that is gyrating without magnetic direction in the Bermuda Triangle. And I saw this on the internet, so it's definitely true, as is this picture of, just a little creature that's hitching a ride along, and, more incidents. Now, some cruise lines have more trouble than others, and, of course, it's all due to aliens, actually. We probably, that's the default. But what the oceanographers have said, this is a phenomena created by under seabed natural gas, methane and such, that will come bubbling up to the surface, and sometimes will actually catch on fire. This is one gas that came up and caught fire in the Gulf of Mexico. So, but the quality of this bubbles, they will combine as they go up, and so by the time they come up how many thousand meters from the seabed, now they become a big bubble. And so that if you were the forlorn sailor or ship that is out there, you suddenly have what's called a hole in the sea, and your vessel will just drop in, and suddenly you're gone without any time to signal or rescue yourself. Similarly, airplanes will experience a loss of lift when that invisible gas comes up and then changes the specific gravity of the air and will cause the drop of an airplane. I still think it's caused by aliens, but meanwhile, on the bottom of the Caribbean and places, and especially in the Gulf of Mexico, there are gas deposits so deep that they freeze. So this is frozen methane, and this is the source of the bubbles. And this is a piece of gaseous ice that you can take to the surface, still frozen like a cube of ice, but you can set it on flame, and of course it's a fuel. Well, this led researchers to go down and look at the bottom of the sea here and see what is going on. And they found whole ecosystems of little worms and little shrimp and some shellfish that will live in the gas deposits at the bottom of the sea where there's no light and incredible pressure. You can see there's a little shrimp hanging out in the middle of this ice field of the gas. And then there are other areas that have sinkholes full of brine, meaning that the sea salt has concentrated and created particular pools where, again, they've found some creatures like mussels and other crustaceans and microorganisms can live in this environment. And of course, this is a surprise because people didn't think there would be life at the bottom of the sea, but actually the deeper you go, the more curious, maybe sparse to find, but there's a lot of unusual creatures down there. And recently, in the Caribbean, they found the largest single-cell amoeba called the gromia, and this is a kind of a scratchy photo of it. It is a sort of the size of a golf ball, and it lives by rolling around and ingesting what they call sea snow, which is debris from other creatures and minerals that are descending down to the bottom. So it's not on the menu here yet, but there's a phenomena. And of course, then there's all the plankton, which is the base of the food chain. So there's infinite varieties. It's sort of like counting snowflakes. Everyone's a little different, if similar. And I was captain of a research vessel which was specialized in plankton research. We were a three-masted sail vessel, so we could go out wherever we wanted to go and then slowly gather the catch of the day, which would go into the laboratory for study. And we found all kinds of things. This is a zooplankton, meaning it has an animal-like gut, and then it has little hairs all over its extended arms that can make it move. And so it goes on a daily cycle up high to the light, and then it'll drop. So it travels dozens of meters, but at microscopic size. So it takes a commute every day depending on the light. And then there are more, and then they're fed on by other creatures, and there's sort of a vast microscopic world out there. But about 50% of all the biomass on the planet is actually in plankton and in microscopic creatures. And so here they're fed on by various crustaceans. This one is a beautiful blue, kind of a micro shrimp. This one is called the sea angel. And if you follow this stuff, every month they're finding more remarkable creatures, many gelatinous and almost invisible, but particularly they're all bioluminescent. And then as you get into the shallow waters, you start to get the real coral and the fish and the lobsters and things. The Caribbean has langoustine, sort of a big crayfish. They don't have claws like the northern lobsters. Then you get stars. They're not really a fish, but they're in the shallow waters. And then there's been a particular bloom of many more jellyfish in all the world's oceans, but particularly the tropical oceans the last few decades, mainly by warming and imbalances in the food chain by fishing and such. So you have these, again, very beautiful structural jellyfish that you don't want to get too close to them. The Portuguese man-of-war is in the Caribbean, and that's probably the most dangerous because it floats on the surface and will come up on the beach. Others that just follow the currents, and they've been going, the tropical jellies have been seen now all the way up to the Norwegian waters even. This is a curious one that's been found recently called the Turritopsis, which has been called the immortal jellyfish because it is not so big, but it has the curious quality of if it is eaten half by a turtle, for instance, or it's just damaged, it will fall into itself and go back to a larval state, and then it'll regrow itself. And so some marine biologists have been trying to study what is in the tissue of this jellyfish so that it is literally eternal. And here's another dissident of the deep. This is the Asian lionfish, which you may have heard of. It came on ship's ballast from Asian tropical waters and then has been in Caribbean all the way up to Maine waters as a very voracious reef fish, and it kills all the other fish. So you may see this in a couple of the islands or ports we go, there's a bounty on these fish, and now the local restaurants are encouraged to put them on the menu. They're sort of a white fish, but those great main on it are all deadly poison, so that has to be carefully handled before you can, let's say, serve it. Again, they don't serve it on the restaurant here, not yet, but maybe tomorrow. And then this is a problem in the Caribbean, though. The population has just been growing. Every island is essentially overpopulated now, and the fish stocks have been dropping even without all the international fleets coming in. So unfortunately, some of these very much visited islands have to import their fish to feed the visitors. And then there's a lot of local subsistence fishing. When we go around and look at that, some of these local fish they're catching would have been considered trash fish in the old days, but there's not that much tuna, and the turpons and the other sports fish are on the menu. And so this is one of the problems of how do you protect the fisheries enough so that there'll be enough for people to eat. Famously, the conch of the Bahamas and other islands was sort of the easy picking for lunch, and they still serve it in many places, but they've had to go out and plant them and grow them like a crop offshore in certain areas. And then there are all the other creatures. This is the famous octopus who is so intelligent it knows when to blush. And then turtles, of which there are many kinds, the loggerheads and the leatherbacks. And in beaches in the Caribbean, they've now made sanctuaries for them. And in Bequia, they have a turtle restoration program. We may go see that when we get there, where, for instance, the females will come up on the beach, they'll lay thousands of eggs, and curiously they cry while they're laying eggs, and then they go back to the sea, and then the hatchlings come up, but usually only 1 of 1,000 make it back as an adult because the birds and the other fish come and get them. So now they're nurturing them and then sending them back out, and they come back to where they were born, like a salmon. This is the now extinct Caribbean monk seal, which Columbus mentioned were so numerous they would just go chase them down and spear them and catch them for food. Now they are officially extinct. So that's the only tropical pinniped seal that used to live in Caribbean waters. The manatee, though, is still surviving, if diminishing, all the way from South American coast all the way into Florida. Its biggest enemy, of course, is humans and boats running into them. And you may know that this was the creature that when European sailors first saw that, they thought it was a mermaid. Now that sailor really should have had his eyes checked. But then there are the other creatures. I won't go on too much about the whales. There are 20 species of whales in the Caribbean, and we are going to Dominica, where the sperm whales gather to breed and calve. And there are also a lot of humpbacks and some right whales in the Dominican Republic and other parts of the islands where they can be predictably found. They come to, they usually feed in the north, and then they come down to have a vacation around the Caribbean and give birth. And so these humpbacks are particularly identifiable because that is the hump of the back, and they also gather in large groups, and they're very social, and you can hear them singing. They have this baleen cartilage in their mouth, so they are filter feeders, and they'll gather around as a group, and they'll bubble up the water where there are fish, and then they'll, or whatever, krill, shrimp, things like that, and they'll gobble it all down. They can swallow a ton of food a day, but it all goes through a throat the size of a grapefruit. They also have a lot of display. They like to jump. They like to flap their wings. They come up and look at you. You can see endless documentaries now about how the whales have been found to have such social nature, advanced linguistics between the group. And they found that particularly the humpback whale that has such distinctive vocalisms has a curious structure in its head, which is like an hourglass that it is full of half air and half water. And when the whale wants to sing, it'll push out the water, make the sound, and then let the water back in. So it's like, if you can imagine singing underwater, but they have an anatomical adaptation to do that. And then they often just come up and flap their tails, just happy to see us. And of course, you can identify the individual by the markings on their tail. But again, on shore, we have the mangrove forests, which have taken a particular turn for the worse over many years because they've been cleared from many islands. For instance, the British Virgin Islands have lost 80% of their mangrove on the shore. This is an unusual plant because it can live in salt water. It can draw out water and expel about 90% of the salt by evaporation and dropping off their leaves. So they live in the shore, and they tangle their roots so much that a hurricane cannot uproot them. And this is an adaptation that's also seen in some of the trees ashore, that the community of plants grab hold of each other so that when a hurricane comes, they will survive along with whatever is living in them. And they are particularly known for all of their different fish, birds, snakes, lizards all live in the mangrove because there's shelter and safety there. But when they're cut out for just development or access, that means that the islands are exposed to the full fury of weather. And so they've been replanting them in places. But in just a short shore, there are all kinds of little lizards, and this is the snipe, and this is an anole that has the curious function of whenever there's a hurricane coming, the lizards somehow know it, and maybe because they have better internet access, and they lay their eggs just before the storm, and then the storm will wipe over the island, kill all of the mature anole lizards, but they will have seeded the ground with all their eggs, so their species continues. Well, there are also these big iguanas around here. This is in Puerto Rico. I just took this picture there to remind myself how, isn't it curious how people sort of begin to look like their pet? Well, anyway, this one had a close relationship dancing with this particular friend. And then there's all kinds of things. There are little coconut crabs, and then many different birds. Here's a red-chested blackbird, and then a kind of a Caribbean dove, a yellow-breasted woodpecker, and there are many, many hundreds of species. And if those of you going all of today to Yunque, the national park, they're full of these great variety of bird life in the forest. They've been lost in much of the other islands that have been cut. This is a sea kite, kind of a hawk. Then the loro parrot, Puerto Rican parrot, and this is the Cicero parrot of Dominica, with a beautiful blue and iridescent look to them, and lots of hummingbirds. I mean, I get hummingbirds coming from the Caribbean into my backyard up in upstate New York. It's like a harbinger of spring that they've come back all the way as a migratory bird. Others are more stationary, the different herons and the pelican, for instance. You'll see plenty of those in some of the harbors. And how's the old ditty go? A wonderful bird is the pelican, whose bill can hold more than his belly can. He can put in his beak food enough for a week, but I'm damned if I can see how the hell I can. Anyway, then there's the frigate birds. We'll see some of them flying. They have a characteristic split tail, but this is the male in his formal evening dress for the female nesting on the islands. Particularly down the South Caribbean coast, there are a lot of flamencos, and so these are something great herds of them that come down in the marshes of Venezuela and Colombia. And this is a red ibis, and then up in the hills, there are, in some of the islands, there are a few spider monkeys, but not many. They probably came over on rafts from South America and have settled in a few places. But all these creatures, their great enemy is this, the great hurricane, which is the Mayan word for the god of the wind. And they begin with dust storms off of West Africa. The dust in the air gets up, and then they begin to circulate over the warm water, and then begin the classic tropical depression of the air coming up, the warm air coming up, and then there's a downward in the cold air into the eye, and then a circular flow, which is counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere. But then you have this path of a storm can be estimated, and we all follow this, but the old sailor's instructions, you always put that storm on your starboard quarter, which means you're sailing out of harm's way. If you go any other way, you're going to get caught in the storm. And so these storms come battering at the Caribbean and central North American coast, but there's a few that are generated in the Pacific, and of course there are other ones in tropical waters in Asia where they're called a typhoon or other cyclone, but they're all the same phenomena. If you are in the Caribbean, though, there's this point that's called the convergence of the storms coming across the Atlantic, and if they go north of Puerto Rico, the eye, let's say, in the full fury of the storm, then it'll go up into the Bahamas and hit Florida or go all the way up to the north. Or if it is below Puerto Rico, it'll go down into the Caribbean basin and then have its way in Central America or go even into the Gulf of Mexico. So this is Katrina, I think, this one. They all sort of look the same when they get that big, but the destruction you get to read about. This is St. George, Grenada, which has been not completely rebuilt after this was, I'm not sure which hurricane this was, but it took the roof off the cathedral and left tales of debris and destruction and death all through that area, and it happens more and more now. This is in St. Martin's, a ship that didn't get out to sea. Usual instructions for a ship is you leave port, you go out away from the storm so you don't get bashed on the shore. And then there are other phenomena. We may see one of this. This is a water spout, which is basically a tornado at sea, which is a phenomena that happens in a squall. So you may have unsettled weather, but this is not a hurricane, but it can come and just pick you literally out of the sea, like this famous Winslow Homer painting. I hope he made it back in. Well, the problem is this is an example of how the Caribbean is both a beautiful place, but it also has tremendous destruction, either by hurricanes or volcanoes or earthquakes. The worst one was in 2010 when earthquake happened in Haiti, killed over 250,000 people. And that's maybe an example of where there's so many people, then there's so much destruction. The original inhabitants were few and far between, and probably also knew when to run up into the hills and take shelter. And so that the human impact on the ecology of the Caribbean is extensive, particularly through deforestation, mostly because of making charcoal for making rum or else building ships. And so you have the leftover cane fields, often replaced by banana crops now, but they are also subject to a hurricane can wipe them all out and they'll have to start all over again. And so you have island after island with a, let's say, always a growing population and now diminishing resources. So in some places where life was simple but they had subsistence, they do not have that now. They depend on the almighty visitors, which we're doing our part to contribute. But we'll go and see different parts of the islands that had lush tropical forests. Now they're used for cattle. They're still clearing land in a few places, and this has led to desertification of certain islands, and particularly this in the Hispaniola, Haiti, and Dominican Republic a few years ago had so much fire that it created desert zones, and this is the great ecological tragedy of human impact. Same thing happened in the Mediterranean and many parts of Asia now even. But this is the great enemy of the land in a way, because the cattle, the goats, then the imported cats and rats and all that have changed the ecology considerably, and so there are reserves, but it's not a good story. But then there are the aliens who can come in and enjoy it anyway. So you can see the development has tremendous impact. This is in Colombia. This is in Santa Marta. So you have the world wanting to go to the beach. And another part of the Caribbean, this is Gulf of Mexico, you have runoff from agricultural and industrial sources. All the Mississippi creates a vast plankton bloom like this at certain season, but it also has a whole area of dead zone where there's no oxygen in the water. And so this is, again, human impact upon the ocean is severe, especially the oil industry over in the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of rigs, many of them disabled, many of them leaking. And perhaps the worst is in Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela, where this vast, 100-mile-long lake is now covered with oil and is pretty much ecologically dead now. And of course, the people who would have been made wealthy by the oil industry are impoverished there now. So that's the problem, but there are, let's say, with all these troubles that are human-induced, there may be human solutions, and the Caribbean has a way of coming back on its own, or it can be assisted. So there's some designs for how do you have an ecologically off-the-grid and carbon-neutral housing or resorts to be built. or power your shore with tidal flow or other offshore energy development that will get us off oil. And so the people of the Caribbean are very aware of all these problems, and they've made more and more preserves so that they have not allowed the same kind of concretization of certain islands. And they've tried to restore some of the damage to the coral reefs especially. So here's a project which is typical in many parts of the Caribbean and around the world now, of putting up an artificial reef. This was an area that they had so many decades ago, they had just gone in and mined all the coral to make an airport and put it out and spread it out. So then they realized, well, now there's no more fish. So they started to build these kind of coral pods to plant coral and make an artificial reef. And this has been shown to be useful and successful. And they bring in some species of coral that are heat resistant so that they'll survive even if the temperature of the waters are rising. But if you were a piece of coral or a fish, that looks like a really nice condo with hot water included. And so then they bloom with life again. So this is the miracle of life, that it may be in trouble, but it tends to happen again. And so all these places, we'll be going near Mero, even in Beccia. So they're trying to, let's say, make the consciousness that will preserve these places and improve some of the things that have been damaged, and so that the Caribbean will go on and will be the beautiful place that it is. And so I'll just leave you with a saying, one more proverb. Knowledge to have, yet wisdom to lack, is a man riding backwards on a jackass. Anyway, and here's another one. Follow the river to find the sea and go with the flow. So when the first visitors came here, this was quite a remarkable place. And I'm going to quote Thomas Gage, who wrote a new survey of the West Indies in 1648. And he wrote, "Those who have described these parts before of trades and winds and currents and hurricanes do tell of headlands, harbors, tread ends of the shore, of rocks and isles, wherein they might as well talk of a nut and only show the shell, the kernel neither tasted, touched, nor seen." Well, we are lucky enough to come and have the full experience here, and I wish you a great trip in the Caribbean and enjoy our time together. Thank you very much.